theme song for the Gear Podcast. How's it going, everybody? Uncle Leon, what's going on, buddy?
Mate, I'm having a wonderful morning here. Even better because we have the one and only Chris Baseford joining us for the podcast. Chris, how are you? Where are you joining us from?
I'm doing awesome. I'm actually in Vancouver, Canada right now.
Vancouver, practically around the corner.
I mean, Canadians are basically Australians with snow, so, we definitely feel the kindred spirit there.
West Coasters, right? So that's cool.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
West Coast, and I've actually spent more time in Los Angeles than I have in Canada, although I was born in Canada, but I was in LA for 20 years, came up to Vancouver during the pandemic, and now we're just actually in the middle of planning move back down to the States. So.
Oh, right on.
We've had enough of the rain.
Big time. Chris, would you give us the Reader's Digest version of, for anyone unfamiliar with what you've done, I would say people who watch and listen to this podcast probably like rock music, and they've almost definitely heard things you've worked on. So give us a quick rundown of basically how you got, what you do, how you got started, what you do, and maybe some personal highlights of what you've done along the way.
Sure, absolutely. Well, as with a lot of people these days, I wear kind of all the hats: producer, engineer, mixer, psychologist, therapist, babysitter, all of the cliches of the music studio business. So I kind of do a little bit of everything. I typically will do a lot of mixing, and then I'll get bored of mixing and want to just go track bands, and then I'll sometimes go track for other producers, and then I'll get bored of keeping my mouth shut, and then I'll go produce a couple albums. So I'm kind of bouncing all over the place with kind of what I like to do or what I do. But I started, it seems like a lifetime ago. Well, I guess kind of how I got into this was like most of us. I was into rock music. I played guitar. I was a shitty guitar player. I spent more time twiddling knobs than I did actually learning how to play the instrument. Well, you're actually a good guitar player, so you couldn't have spent that much time twiddling knobs. Not as much as I was.
He twiddles a lot of knobs, that guy.
That's true. That's true. But I eventually kind of like figured out, I'm like, listen, I liked recording demos. I would rent, 4-track and 8-track recorders, and we would do demos. And I loved that way more than I loved like going and playing shows with the band and that kind of thing. And I mean, I liked writing songs and that part of it. But definitely once I kind of figured out what a record producer was, it was like just laser focused on doing that. I'm like, I'm going to make records for the rest of my life. So went to a really shitty recording school, didn't learn anything close to what I needed to know.
Yep. We've all been there.
Figured out a way to weasel my way into a professional recording studio in Toronto where I grew up. I was there for a couple of years, and then the engineer who's kind of my mentor at the time, his name was Lenny DeRose. He was good friends with a guy in LA, another Canadian named Scott Humphrey. Scott was known for his stuff with Rob Zombie and Motley Crue and a bunch of stuff like that. He was actually one of like the kind of the I don't want to say like the pioneers of Pro Tools, but like he was in it like way early. And so one day Lenny came into the studio. I was cleaning up or setting up for a session. He's like, "You're going to LA," and I'm like, "What?" And he's like, "Scott needs a guy in LA like in 3 days." And I'm like, "Oh, okay, cool, whatever." And I thought maybe it was just for like a one-off, and he's like, "No, he needs his engineer's going to do another project. He needs a guy like to do a 3-month album." And so I went to LA and I never came back. And so I worked with Scott for probably like 6 years, maybe 5-6 years. And it was pretty incredible because Scott was already looped in, like he was already working with and was well respected, kind of in the circle of music that I liked. So I was into hard rock and, what's probably now known as like active rock. And so that's kind of what I was into at the time. And unfortunately in Toronto at Sony, like that wasn't yet kind of the music that was kind of coming back into style. So we weren't doing a lot of that. So it was like, I'm going to get to go to LA and make rock records with Rob Zombie and Tommy Lee and all these like my heroes. I was like, I'm in. So went down there, figured out a way to keep that job for a while, and then I met a lot of the people that I still work with today. I kind of met through people that I worked with way back when. Like, obviously, I do a lot of work with Nickelback. I met Chad Kruger through when he came to do some writing on one of Tommy Lee's solo albums. And at the time, this is probably like 2003, 2004, maybe. So Nickelback was big, but not the biggest kind of thing, right? Mm-hmm. I actually recently just told a story to a class that I was just doing kind of a lecture for. Chad had written like half of All the Right Reasons when he came down to LA, and he was like,
wow,
like acoustic guitar playing Photograph, being like, and the words were a little bit different and stuff like that. So it's like, I can vividly remember like him with an acoustic guitar in hand, like being like, yeah, I got this new song. And he's kind of like still kind of figuring it out. But I was kind of enamored with him even back then. Didn't start really working hand in hand with him for another probably 6 or 7 years after that, which was kind of interesting. But yeah, so I did a lot of engineering for Scott, then kind of branched out on my own, started doing production on my own, doing more mixing. I mean, I probably, if anybody's kind of familiar with my work, it's probably from Nickelback. Did some work on a Shinedown album a few albums ago.
Which
did
album
a bunch
was that?
of stuff with Threat to Survival.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So I think I did 2 or 3 songs with Scott Stevens on that record. Did a lot of work with Avril Lavigne for a while. That was kind of some of the pop stuff that I've done. Doing a lot of mixing nowadays. So Daughtry, I've mixed the last couple Scott Stapp albums. Yeah, I mean, like I said, I kind of do a little bit of everything. I love rock music. I love big guitars. I love big, cartoonish drums, and so being able to work with these bands who aren't too precious about needing to sound quote unquote real, kind of gives me a little bit of leeway to do that, which is always fun. So,
I mean, it's awesome because this is all stuff Troy and I have referenced over the years when he's been recording us, right?
Yeah, and that's a list
it's
of
so
bands.
cool to do this.
Yeah, it's like a list of bands and albums and stuff that I've listened to a bunch that I really like. Daughtry is one of my favorite singers, and
he's incredible.
Yeah, what a voice, and so's Chad. Like, man, people do not give that guy respect. We can talk about Nickelback stuff afterwards, but that's what you said is basically the sort of music that I like too. I like big guitars. I really like rock music, and I like when it doesn't have to just sound like AC/DC, and that's also cool too. But it's
absolutely, yeah. I mean, I've almost forgot how to make rock records like that. Like, if somebody tied my hands behind my back and said, you can't use drum samples, or, we've got to use just like 1 amp at a time with 1 microphone on it. Like, I'm sure I could probably figure it out, but I haven't had to make one of those albums in a long time.
Yep.
And ultimately my tendency is always just to, make things, like I said, I use the term cartoon. It's just like, I want to make the cartoon version or like the CGI version of rock music.
Hyper-real is
But think about it. When you go and see a live band, right, the volume does this thing where like a bass guitar or a kick drum becomes this like Tyrannosaurus Rex of a thing.
Yeah.
That if you want that experience on something recorded to scale down, you don't just put a microphone in front of it and leave it. Like, you have to enhance it.
Yeah.
I think what you do.
To just quickly ask you a question, because you mentioned the recording school that you went to. So, because I'm a recording engineer, or I'm a sound engineer, that's my background, and I do the gigs and stuff as well. But when I was studying, and this was in 2005 is when I started, my lecturer, who's an incredible engineer, worked with Paul McCartney, and
wow,
like he did a lot of stuff back a long time ago.
Yeah.
But rule number 1, you can never use EQ. No, if you want something to sound different, you have to move the mic. And so that was the first 3 years of me trying to be a recording engineer, thinking like, I better not EQ. I've got to buy all these mics because it's the wrong mic. I better go, get different variations of this and just keep moving around. It's like, that's not really how it works. And then, don't boost. You can't boost if you're going to EQ something. It can only be cutting.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I'm sure you probably have some.
I want to tell a quick story about that because it's something I haven't actually completely forgot about this until you mentioned that. I was doing something for one of Tommy Lee's solo albums, and I think they were filming. Like it was, they had the whole band, and I can't remember what it was for. But anyways, we basically had to do like a live recording session, full band, which again doesn't happen much anymore either. But so we had to go to a room that was big enough to get the whole band and everything, and so we ended up at Capitol Studios, and so we were in Capitol A. And I mean, if anybody knows, I mean, it's a legendary studio. I love the studio. It's almost besides the point, other than the fact that was Al Schmidt, who's just probably the most legendary engineer of all time. That was kind of like his place, right?
Yeah. And Capitol's gone now, isn't it?
Oh, it's still there.
Oh, still there, right?
It's still there. Yep, Capitol's still there. But he was in the other room, and I'd never met him before, whatever. And I remember, like, again, we're setting up. Tommy is already like when I would EQ drums, I would do everything you just said you're not supposed to do. And then Tommy would come in and almost be like, kind of like a little bummed that it wasn't even more.
Right. Okay. And
so like when I was working with him, and I mean, I still do the same thing today, but it's like, he was one of the guys who kind of forced me to like, come on, let's go more. Like, I mean, and Bob Rock is one of my just like, idols. And when I hear him tell stories about, kind of where some of those drum techniques came from, he sometimes credits Tommy for being kind of the one to push him into getting those like bigger than life sounds. So it was kind of happening to me. Anyways, long story short, I was working and I got the band going and everything was sounding really good. And, like the management starts kind of coming, like we're almost ready to go. And there's like 5 cameras shooting and there's like big, guy sitting in like a crane inside one of those boom things. Like it was crazy. So there's a lot of people in the room and I'm just doing my thing because it's like we're about to roll and it's got to sound good and there's not a lot of time and the whole thing. And I look over and like I feel somebody kind of behind me and I look over and it's Al Schmidt. And I remember the look on his face.
Yep.
And he never said anything to me, although the assistant said something to me.
Right.
The assistant earlier in the day had said something. He's like, all the peak lights and all the VU meters were just pinned. And he's like, yeah, you're really like everything's clipping, or he didn't say clipping because clipping wasn't really the term back then. I can't remember, just like overdriving, something he was saying. He's like, yeah, all the clip lights are going off, all the, the whatever. And I'm like, that's okay. If it didn't sound bad, I would just do it, right? I would just, and then if it started to crap out, I would back off. But anyway, so he'd kind of told me earlier, and I kind of got a feel for, I'm like, okay, these guys aren't probably used to seeing this type of reckless behavior in a recording studio. Anyway, so look around, Al Schmidt's like standing over, almost in the sweet spot behind me, and I could just see, and I kind of turn around, and I'm like, oh, hey, how's it going? And he's like, good. He's like, good. And I could just kind of see in his eyes being like, what the fuck are you doing? And so there was a part of me, and he didn't say anything, and he's like, oh, this, I don't even think he said it sounded good. It probably didn't sound good. But he left, and I just remember thinking to myself, I'm like, he probably thinks we just are a bunch of fucking like morons that have no idea how to record. And to be honest with you, like when it comes to like big rock guys, like we kind of are in a way. But yeah, I remember years later, like reading interviews with him, he's like, he would never use an EQ.
Yep. Famously so, yeah.
Yeah, and like and same thing. So I'm like, I think when you were saying that, I thought back to that. And I'm like, he must have been like, just like, what the fuck? Yeah. Like I had like EQs, like they were dimed, like they couldn't go anymore.
Yeah. Well, I think Al Schmidt was also, if he's going to compress something, if he's going to use an LA2A, it's like, oh, maybe if he gets 1 dB of compression, that's.
I've never understood this. Like go through a compressor and just have the. I'm like, I never understood that. Like I'm like, is it doing something? I don't know. Like whatever. I want to see that thing like bouncing.
Yeah, but that's the problem with, it's not the problem with schools, because like I teach music recording, so like I try and be really open and clear about this sort of stuff, because like there's methodologies that work for people that without, like he invented half of this stuff, you know.
Oh, totally. By the way, that wasn't a dig on him at all. It was hilarious, like seeing like he was just probably appalled.
Well, absolutely. But you know, like he's developed like methods of working that's worked for him for years and years, and that's awesome to get that sort of sound. But like even in that era, so that's what like 2005.
Yeah, that was probably like that. Probably even earlier. Yeah. And to be quite honest with you, if I went back and listened to what was coming out of those speakers, it probably was fucking terrible.
Well, maybe not. But if you think about the reference material back then, like we didn't have YouTube videos where people were going through and doing stuff. It's like Behind the Glass. Did you ever read that book?
About 45 times.
Yeah. So it's like that was maybe as good as you got, and a few articles in magazines and stuff, but people it just wasn't there. So like for me, so I had the same sort of teaching where it's like, oh, well, you can't, if you hear the compression, then you're doing too much. And I learned that from being 17. Yeah. And then it's like a conscious 5 to 10 years of trying to unlearn the bad habits that develop when you're really young. That's a tough thing. I mean, you could say the same with guitar stuff, with distortion. Yeah. Like if you've, there's a music school here where I have a feeling there's one guitar teacher that is afraid of distortion, because I've worked with his students that have come out, and I'll plug in any of these amps. It's like, no, turn the gain down. I'm just like, man, it sounds fucking terrible. Like, how's this? Like, we can't work. Like, I can't get the sound you want. Like, so anyway, it's these bad habits that develop, and so I try and be pretty open-minded, and I try and tell people, oh, this is my opinion. Use your ears. Do whatever the fuck you want. Anyway,
I mean, there's techniques, and there's not rules, but like there's things that are predictably work, and there are things that predictably don't work. And I mean that's as close as you'll get me to say, oh, that this is the rule, right? It's not a rule.
That's such a good way of putting it.
But it's like you don't have to go down 15 wrong roads to find the one good road for a lot of what we do.
Yep.
But when you are looking for something different, or when you are looking to kind of push the envelope a little bit, or you that's when you start to have to, you're like, yeah, you know what, I'm going to try this thing that, you know what, I've tried this 3 or 4 other times before and it never really worked, but I think I might try it a little differently, and maybe there's a different spin, and all of a sudden it starts to work.
Yeah.
I've never really, like I said, I've never really gotten the transparent thing. I listened to a podcast the other day, and they had, I can't remember who was on, but they were talking about their vocal chain, and they said something about whatever compressor they were using. I can't remember what it was. And they're like, yeah, it's just like, it's a really transparent. I'm like, well, if it's transparent, what's the point?
Yeah.
Right? Like if you can't hear it, I don't understand the point. Mm-hmm. And so if they're like, oh, well, it levels out the volume, and it's like, well, then that's not transparent. It's you're hearing the volume. Like, so it's not that it has to have a bunch of tone, or like, roll off a bunch of top end, or have a bunch of mid-range distortion. It's not like it has, or, really fuck with the transients or anything like that. Like you can just use it for level control. But if you're hearing it adjust the volume, to me, that's not transparent. No, you're hearing volume adjustments.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me, there's often, with so many of these things, people, I guess, working in different disciplines, you can talk past each other a lot of the time. So it would be like, imagine you're working in like a fine dining Michelin star restaurant, but then you want to cook like Texas style barbecue.
Yeah.
There's
obviously,
right. There's obviously techniques which are going to be shared between them, but there are extreme edge cases in both of them that wouldn't apply to either. So it's like, if you're recording, I don't know, like Julian Lage, for example, like what he does, like amazing, like jazz style solo electric guitar.
Yeah.
You're probably not going to do that the same way you do like a Shinedown record. It's just, which leads me into specifically guitar sounds and, for like, and I want to get your feel on this, right? Because you always read this on forums. Oh, you want a better guitar sound? Turn up the mids. So how do you feel about like, one, scooping the mids, cranking the bass on an amp, like just going full cartoon, but like also where do you crank the mids? Because obviously, I want to get your read on getting that giant chungus guitar sound? Like say, like something I know we referenced with Rust, like the Ragdoll song, right? You know, and lots of people say like, and they often say it apologetically. I'm like, you don't need to apologize about that because it sounds awesome. It's like, kind of sounds a bit like Nickelback. It's like,
because the song, I think Feed the Machine was the song that I kept pulling up and referencing.
Nice. It's like, you know, like I wanted that just like, you hear that on the radio and you're just like, well, this is insane.
Just so
there was a lot in there.
Just for reference on that quickly, like, and that song, it's like, that was 2019. I think that album just came out and I was mixing the song. I'm like, oh, what's something modern that just came out that probably has this out? And like, oh, Nickelback just put an album out however long ago. Let's try that one. And I really like the song. I like that album a lot. And that was the reference. But anyway, that was, Thank you for that, for helping me with that mix.
Of course. Thank you for digging it. That's, So here's one thing I will say, maybe, and you know, this is the anti-forum speak.
Yes,
I strongly believe in when we say reference, I don't mean referencing another thing, but you have to have a frame of reference, right?
Okay.
Everything's relative, so there needs to be like what's our ground zero, right? Where's our kind of our equator? So if somebody says you got to crank the mids, well, if we're talking about Slayer, if you've already got a Slayer-esque sound, you do not need to crank any more mids. If we're talking about, I mean, I'm trying to think of like an overly scooped, I don't know, like Justice for All or something like that or whatever, and you're like, you got to crank the mids, and it's kind of like, again, within the context of that mix on the Injustice for All record, it's kind of like, well, actually that sound kind of works. You don't need to crank the mids. If you cranked the mids, that would fuck everything else up, and then you'd just be kind of chasing your tail. Like we added mids in the guitars. Well, now we got to add
bass guitar.
Now we got to add bass guitar, exactly, right? So there's all these things. So whenever somebody says something, let's say makes an absolute statement, to me, I almost just discard it.
Yeah. There's obviously a kernel of truth in it, but also it needs to be contextualized, right?
100%. And that's kind of what I'm getting at. So if somebody said like, hey, let's talk about, you know, hey, the rectifier sound. And I guess maybe that's kind of like when people say stuff like that, they forget to, like you said, they forget to provide a frame of reference or to put it in context with something. So if somebody just said to me like, yeah, I don't like rectifiers because they're just too scooped. Well, then I would say, well, have you ever tried turning up the mids? Have you ever tried putting a tube screamer in front of it? Have you ever tried like really fucking with the presence knob and really finding something that works? Have you ever left the settings in that scooped position and put the 57 more on the center of the cone? Because don't tell me if you put a 57 on the center of a cone, or you know, on the dust cap, that you need to add more mids. You probably don't. So there's all of these other variables that just get left out of the conversation, to where it's like, it's not that I don't like having that conversation. I mean, I can get as nerdy as anybody with a lot of this stuff, but it almost kind of just discredits the entire conversation. And I'm just like, okay, we're somebody's just looking to arm wrestle, and if we're just going to arm wrestle, then let's just go find a table and arm wrestle. We don't need to do it with guitar amps. You know what I mean?
You know what's really funny about that, like forum speak, is because we have 25 years of like documentation. You can go back and find the period in like March 2013 when everyone was talking about, oh no, you have to use this particular pedal, and if you want to get a good guitar sound, oh actually no, it's now this mic that you've got to use. Like it's really weird. I've gone back. It's like, I remember when I started reading on Gearspace. And this is like almost 20 years ago. It's like at this particular time, everything was like, oh, you'd never use reverb on anything. You can't use reverb, and it's like, that was the style of that month, you know, like it all comes and goes. It's really funny. And the crank the mids thing, it's just, who knows what the flavor of the month is this month.
Yeah, and for me, I mean, I guess going back to kind of like constructive, like how do you go about getting a sound? Again, I find my personal tendencies vary drastically depending on at what point in the recording process I'm getting the sound. So,
Right.
With a lot of, I mean, I'll use Nickelback as an example. Like when me and Chad go in to start a song, he might have a guitar riff, he might have a melody, he might have a lyric, whatever it is. Most of the time, we'll start with a guitar. He'll either be playing a guitar, just kind of working out the song a little bit. And while he's doing that, I just start programming like a backing track so he has something to play with. Or he might say, hey, I've got this riff, like just pull up, tempo, tap, see where we're at, pull up a click, let me play this riff, 1,000 times until I get it exactly the way I want. And then we'll start building around that. So I find when you're just putting a guitar to a click, the tendency is to just make it encompass all the frequencies,
Yep.
And then when you start adding rhythm guitars on, or if as the production builds up, you start, let's say tripling and quadding, or maybe you're adding different parts. All of a sudden now you can kind of start making some more specific decisions based off of how it fits with, number one, what the part is. Number two, what's going on in the rest of the production. What's the guitar sound like? Some guitars are brighter. Some guitars are kind of more mid-focused, right? So again, it's hard to have that conversation with somebody who just wants like, hey, what's your setting? Or give me your fractal preset, right? You're like, I don't know this. Like, I've actually shared presets with people that I've used on albums, like just kind of like internally with, kind of in my kind of circle that we run in, and we'll share drum samples and guitar presets or loops or whatever, right? And I've had a few people be like, are you sure that's the sound you used on like whatever? And I'll be like, yeah. Like if I soloed it out, you'd hear it. And within the context of whatever their production is, it just does not work.
And the person playing into it as well, like maybe it's not going to work with someone else's right hand. It's just, yeah.
Totally. Yeah. So it's one of those cop-out answers of like, well, it depends, but it does depend.
It does.
But again, instead of just saying it depends and not digging into the conversation, I mean, I think ultimately you kind of, I like to kind of ask questions, even if they're rhetorically, to myself or to the people I'm working with, or even if I'm mentoring somebody or whatever it is, be like, listen to the sound and just ask the question, like, what's number one, is there anything wrong with it? Like, so if you're tracking rhythm guitars and you've already got bass and you've already got maybe a scratch vocal and drums and maybe some, loops and some synth stuff, whatever, right? If you're getting a tone and you're like, okay, well, I want a heavy, let's say, just because we were talking about like a kind of a rectifier, kind of scooped, kind of sizzly, big sound, right? Pull something up that or kind of start tweaking whatever, and then listen to it in context and ask yourself the question: is there what am I missing? Mm-hmm. What do I have too much of? Is there something wrong with it? Is there something that do I not hear the part enough? Is it abrasive? Like, you just start asking yourself these questions, and those then inform what you do to it. And then I think the kind of the art of engineering or the science or whatever it is then figuring out how to go about rectifying those problems, right? Pardon the pun.
It's a good one. We approve.
Yeah, but it's like, and it could be something as simple as, we're talking about like mic placement, or if you're dealing with IRs, a different IR. Like it's amazing. I've done this. I did this test years ago when I got my first Axe effects. I remember thinking, this is my brain still works this way. I always have to remind myself. I'm like, stop thinking this way. But my brain thinks in like the physical world, like the real world. Yep. So whenever there's something like when the Axe effects first came out, I remember I remember asking for something that they eventually implemented, and I know I wasn't the only one asking for it, so I'm not taking credit for it. But I wanted a way to not fuck with any of like the controls that didn't actually exist on the amp. I'm like, when I pull up a Fender Champ, there shouldn't be bass, mid, and treble. Like that should that should not exist, right? Or there shouldn't be 2 gain knobs for everything, or there shouldn't be this like presence for an amp that didn't, or a depth for an amp that didn't have a depth. Like I didn't want to look at it, and I'd be very disciplined, like not to touch those knobs if I knew they didn't exist on the real amp. Yep. And I mean, it's an ignorant way of dealing with it. But I remember just being blown away by how an IR changed everything, and how having the same amp through 3 different IRs sounded like 3 different rigs, but using 3 different amps through the same IR actually didn't sound like as drastically different.
Yep.
And that was like kind of like, holy shit. Like, and I knew that from miking amps. Like, and that was something I do miss about miking amps. It was like, it's almost impossible to get the same sound twice.
Yeah. Yep.
And so one of the things, not to kind of go down this road, but like rock music is kind of gotten pretty like homogenized, right? Like everybody's got the same samples, everybody's got the same guitar plugins, everybody's got the same preset packs for the fractals. Like it's then what do you do with them? And that's the thing I really try to I just try to encourage people. I'm like, okay, yeah, you have like, even with like some of the fractal presets that I've given away, I make very clear to everybody, these are starting points. And so instead of dialing in a sound and everything's kind of perfect and be like, oh, well, this is what you use for that thing. I'm like, no, this is my starting point. I'm like, this would be the virtual version of when I worked at the chop shop with Scott Humphrey, and we had 10 amps and 8 cabinets, always mic'd up with 2 mics on every cabinet, and they were all coming into the board. And it was funny because Amp Farm was the thing at the time, right? And people would come in and they'd be like, this is like real Amp Farm, because we had splitters, so I could split to like 8 amps at the same time, and somebody would be playing, and I'll be like, okay, here's the diesel, here's a triple rectifier, here's the nailer, here's the Marshall Jubilee, here's the matchless. If somebody brought something in, we had a spot they could bring theirs. Like here's and it was always mic'd up, and you could mix and match and do all the stuff, right? And even if I tried, even if I recalled the mic placement, even if I recalled all the settings, like it was never the exact same. Like if we had to punch in a part later, it was such a pain in the ass. Yeah. I do appreciate that now about like the fractals and the plugins and stuff like that. Like that is awesome. But there was something cool. Like at the beginning of every project, I would go and kind of like re-optimize the mic positions, because even just the vibrations in the room would sometimes move the mics, right? So I would go and make sure, like if I was like multi-miking a cabinet, that it was kind of had the phase relationship I wanted, and I would find the sweet spot. So every at the beginning of every album, even if I ended up in quote unquote the same place every time, it was never the same.
Yeah. Yep.
And so there was a little bit of just kind of randomness, and a little bit of like not chaotic in the sense of like the sounds were chaotic, but it's like it was different just because just physics, right? Yeah. It was just like it was different. Now everything can get very much the same. So it's kind of like that's okay, but we have to be disciplined as producers and guitar players and engineers and writers, whatever. We have to be more disciplined to be like, okay, like just that's one of the reasons I love the Dynacabs on the fractals. It's almost like, unless you're typing in numbers, it's like grab that little ball and move it around, and you'll never get in the same spot twice.
Exactly. And there's like an intuitive thing, right? Because it plays more into that, I guess, use your ears, where you're like, okay, it's iterative. So you're like, is it too bright? Well, I'll move it away. Is it too boomy? Well, I'll move it away. Is it not boomy enough? I'll move it in. And then you're just like, okay, I'm listening to it in the track. I'm listening to this. I just am where I am. And once it feels right, I can park that and move on to the next part of the process. And it is just part of the process, obviously.
Yeah. But even just doing that, like, I just kind of challenging people to be like, listen, like, don't, if you use a preset, yeah, it's a starting point. Mm-hmm. Grab that little ball and move it around. And if you end up in the exact same spot, fine. Like, or even if on the amp, on the preamps or whatever you're using, if you're using a plug-in, if you're using a real amp, whatever, like just grab the knob, dime it, turn it all the way down, find the sweet spot, leave it there, and just don't even look at it. Like, and that will just introduce a little bit of randomness, not randomness, because you're making the informed decisions.
Yep.
But it's not just the same every time. And then when you got guys like me who might be recording, 2 or 3 or 4 albums a year, then all of a sudden, all those albums start to sound the exact same. And then it's like, then you've got 10 guys like me doing the same thing. And then all of a sudden, everything just sounds the same. And it does. And a lot of it does right now, unfortunately. Whereas kind of, back in the day, so to speak, that was impossible. You couldn't do it. We wanted to do it. We wanted the ability to have perfect recall on everything. And people be like, hey, that sound you got 4 years ago, can we plug that in? You're like, well, yeah, but that amp's been retubed and that speaker cone blew, and I don't have that mic that everybody on Gear Slut said I needed to buy. I sold that thing after we made that album. Now it's kind of like, yeah, I can pull up patch 364 and there it is.
Yep.
So that's cool. But don't just always go to that. Like, grab some knobs, start moving stuff, grab the mouse, grab the little ball in the Dynacab, use your ears and just find the spot.
It's cool, but it's not necessarily better or worse. I think that's the important way to contextualize it. Like, there's advantages and disadvantages to both. So, how do you go about recreating that?
I've kind of feel that the Kemper is the product that's probably the worst for all of that. Like, because I feel like with Axe FX, because everything is infinitely tweakable, like outside of the Dynacab stuff too, you can just really do whatever you want. Where the times that I don't own a Kemper, so I've only used them a couple of times in the studios. But it's like, a band comes in with their Kemper and they pull up their preset, and it's like, oh, cool, where did you get this from? Oh, I downloaded a cab pack from so and so. It's like, not a cab pack, IR pack. Oh, what do you call it? Profile pack. It's like, oh, just feels a bit lame. Like, it sounds good. I guess like you can sort of take it as being like, right, the sound is the same, but the performance of the music going through it's going to be different, so it'll have that sort of that change in it. I can appreciate that, but yeah, it's just in terms of everything just feeling very like homogenized. Like, certainly it's just boring, Like, I'm big into amps, as you can see from the back there, just because it's like fun. Like, it's no better or worse than using the digital stuff. But in fact, I don't want to ask you about that as well.
Yeah.
But they all kind of sound a bit different too. Like, my Recto is pink, so obviously it sounds different.
Obviously.
And you have to
1,000%.
And so you have to use it. So yeah, it has a sound to it. It's probably not that different to every other rectifier, but maybe it's just a tiny bit different, and therefore, you're going to get a different result. And I kind of like that. But I was going to ask, well, I've got a couple of questions actually. So are you just using Axe FX for guitar stuff at the moment? You're not using any amps or cabs or anything? Or still?
You know what? I use anything and everything. And sometimes I'm very strategic about why I'm using certain things. For instance, if I'm collaborating with a band that maybe that's the other thing. How we make records these days has changed drastically because of the technology. So there was a scenario where, like, I would never not be in the room while the rhythm guitars were being tracked. And it's like, now I would probably say, maybe a third of those albums, it's kind of like the guitar player's really good. Mm-hmm. They do demos that sound great. They know how to record. They know how to listen for stuff that's in tune and in time. And it's kind of like, no, I'll do all the rhythms and I'll send them to you. So in that scenario, like, well, you know what? For this, we're gonna use plugins. We're gonna use you have a fractal, like whatever it is, right? So that way we have that ability. We're not all in the room to make a decision on, does everybody like this amp sound? Does this work? Like, is the mic in the right spot? Yeah, we're committing to this. Okay, good. Let's go. Like, so obviously what I use is almost as much of, well, to be honest with you, to me, what I use is probably like 90% logistical.
Yep.
And that I think ultimately speaks volumes to how good the technology has gotten. Something talking about amps that's interesting because so I mean I've got a couple amps here that you can't see, but I still own quite a few amps, and it's funny when people are like I have a plug-in with ML that's ML Sound Labs that's my Diesel VH4.
That's right. That's super rad.
Yeah, and people are like, and then they're like, so do you don't use your but you use the real one because you have that, right? And I'm like, I haven't. No, I it's not even with me. It's on the other side of the country. Like I don't even have it here. But I do records all the time where I'm using the Diesel, and it's like it's okay with me. I'm good with it. But the thing that I've kind of come to the conclusion of, and for better or worse, I'm just going to be fully like honest and transparent. I've come to the conclusion that like having an amp in the room, forget the sound for a second. Like if somebody can hear the difference, that's cool. Again, I move the microphone a centimeter and it's going to sound drastically way more different than the sound that you're hearing, the difference between my Fractal and my, Mark IV. Like it's pretty damn good these days, right? There is something really cool about walking into a studio and seeing a bunch of amps. And so I just got a new amp. Yeah. I just got the new Rev generator, which is fucking awesome.
Yeah. How do you like that? Yeah.
It's awesome. I don't mean this to diminish how awesome of an amp it is, but I can still smell the new like Tolex and like the tubes when and I'm just like, I love the smell of amps as much as I do the sound of them.
Dude, I say this all the time. People are like, but like, you've got the real Boogie Mark IV. Like, what's the difference between that and the Fractal? It's like the smell. Like, the smell. And they go, ha, ha, ha. It's like, no, man, seriously. It's like, it's like, when
I've got a Mark IV here too.
Yeah, when you open a new Gibson guitar and they've just got that fragrance in the case.
Yeah.
That puts you in a space where the guitar suddenly sounds better.
Yep. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about that for a second because this conversation, I have this conversation with some people and one of three things happens. Either they're like, "You're so full of shit," or they think I'm fucking with them, or they're like, I've never thought about that, and then you have a good conversation. So I am.
Why not all of the above?
All of the above. A little bit of all of it, right? I am of the belief, and I can only speak for myself. Maybe this is different to differing degrees with different people. I am I can say for certain that aside from just like the actual sonics, let's say the air moving and what's actually being picked up in the room, whatever, right? My brain will interpret those sonics different based off of a bunch of other external factors. So I've mentioned the story a couple times of when I started mixing in the box. And I used to mix on an SSL. And when I started mixing I started to have to do mixes in the box. And I had a really hard time doing it. And the weird thing is, when it started kind of clicking for me was when I was looking at something that actually was a very good graphical representation of an SSL. and so I've had this conversation with people about that. So with amps, how I refer to amps is like, there's an experience. And it's not about it. I don't want to say it's not about the sound, because the experience can then make your brain interpret the sound differently. And I think when people talk about like the differences between real tube amps and fractals or what all the other stuff, like the plugins, I think a lot of the time, I mean, yeah, I can't argue what you hear or what you feel. Like, I can't feel what you feel. I can't hear what you hear. And ultimately, your brain is interpreting the sound waves and is taking in all these other things, right? So I think some people are more sensitive to the external factors than others, and other people block all that shit out, and it's just what's coming through the speakers that influences what they're hearing, right? And so there's a thing with real amps where the best analogy or the best example I like to think of is like, if you were an 18-year-old kid and you got a record deal, okay? I don't know if that's even, I don't even know if 18-year-old kids are like, I want a record deal these days. Maybe that doesn't happen. But whatever the scenario is, you're an 18-year-old kid and you somehow have come into the scenario where you get to go into a studio with maybe a producer who made one of your favorite albums or all of your favorite albums or whatever, right? And somebody else is paying for it and you're like, oh my God, it's a dream come true. If you walk into the studio and you walk into the studio and it's a big empty room with a pair of speakers, an IKEA desk with a keyboard and a mouse, and like an SKB case with a Kemper sitting on the floor. Can you make a great record? Absolutely. Absolutely. You pull out your guitar out of your case, you plug into that Kemper, you have your download your packs that probably sound really fucking good. And the engineer or the producer has all his toys in the box and it's all great. And you can make a great sounding album if you've written great songs and you're doing it right. It's great. But you can't tell me, and I've come full circle on this because I almost like went kind of not minimalist, but I've pared things down a lot. And I'm almost now retracting from that. I'm like, no. There's something missing now. Like I need to bring shit back. So going back to that example, you can't tell me that that's going to be the same experience, which then will produce the same quote unquote product, the final result. If that kid walked into a studio and it had a rack of all of his amps that he'd only ever seen on the internet and he'd only ever read about in guitar forums, he'd never in a million years thought he'd be able to actually plug into one. And there's 10 of them.
Yeah.
And it's like, you know what we're going to do the first day? What are we going to do? We're just going to plug into every single one of these and you're just going to play.
Yep.
Are we going to record anything? No. I just want you to play with this shit. Like, these are toys.
Yep.
Have fun. And so if you do that, I have a really hard time believing that the final result of that album or that record or whatever you're doing, even if it's just that recording of that day, I have a hard time believing that that's not going to be better in some way. And I say better because talk about context and relative. Like, what's the criteria of better? We can define that all we want. But you can't tell me that that's not going to be better than if you just come and plug into a Kemper and be like, all right, start tracking.
No, absolutely. And I mean, that's literally why I have this stuff too. It looks cool and it's fun.
And that's okay.
And
not in like a bullshit, well, I need to fake it before I make it kind of thing. It's what you said, it's the fun thing. Yeah. And it's the like, remind yourself why you're doing this. And you know what?
Yeah.
90% of it is bullshit, but 10% of it is magic. You know, like a fucking diesel VH4 through a boogie oversized cab. If you've never done that before and you finally get to do it, that's an experience you'll never forget. Yeah. And you just immediately learn things about, one, why people consider it great, and two, why 90% of the stuff about it is actually bullshit. But still that 10% of like, it's great and this is why. And you're like, oh, I like playing music. This is something that I want to do. Can we start recording something? I think you're just fucking bang on, man. Like, not from the like, well, you need to, like show the tools, but yeah, it's because then like there's no, but if I had done something different, you don't die wondering, basically.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing is like, the playing devil's advocate to that. I also work with people who don't give a shit about that. And they almost find it, they find it distracting and they find it like it gets in the way of their creative flow. So if it was kind of like, okay, now we're gonna do the double, and they're like, okay, cool, let's go move the amp or move the mics and let's plug in a different head. They're like, what are you doing? Like I'm chomping at the bit here. Like, I don't care.
Let
like,
me play.
Just right. So you gotta. I mean, I guess that's one of the things that you got to be able to recognize as a producer. Like, who are you dealing with?
Yeah.
Do you need to provide somebody with an experience to get them like motivated and enthusiastic and kind of get that performance, or is that dog and pony show going to be a hindrance because somebody just wants to get to work. And I'll tell you right now, if I've got a diesel VH4 with that Mesa oversized cab, I've got 10 patches on my Fractal that, again, remove all the other stuff. If we're just listening at the end of the day through the speakers and we're comparing just physics or like comparing what the sound waves are doing, the difference is minute.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But how that person plays, what that experience is like, who knows? Maybe they come into the studio the next day and they're like, dude, I was so pumped up. I just want to play. And they write, and while they're trying out all the amps, they write the riff that ends up being their career song.
Yep.
That probably doesn't happen when you're just like, I've got a preset that I've used on the last 10 records that you've heard. We're going to use that, plug in, start playing. Mm-hmm. And so again, I consider myself relatively objective. So I just like to acknowledge what things are for what they are. And so
but you're also a facilitator.
Yeah.
You know, for lots of different things. Are you facilitating someone getting the job done? Yeah. Are you facilitating them getting inspired? Are you facilitating, I don't know, like helping someone who's new maybe to the process or the industry, like understand the process? There's as you said right at the start, you wear a lot of hats in that position. So that's important, which makes me want to segue into, I saw you posted on the Fractal forum about getting Nickelback set up on the Axe effects for their touring stuff, right? Can you tell us a little bit about that process and how you approached it?
Yeah, it was a little bit of an experiment with varying degrees of success. So I won't go too. I mean, I'm not super intimately familiar with like what the current situation, like what the current rig is.
Right.
But they are using fractals, and I went out at the beginning of this last tour. They did like full production rehearsals in an arena, whatever, and so I went out and kind of just was there as a little bit of like kind of QC, just kind of it's nice for the band to have an ear at like they can't listen, right? They're up there performing, they're rehearsing. They can't see it, they can't hear it the way that somebody in the crowd does, right? Mm-hmm. So they kind of sometimes they involve me for that as just a kind of a level of quality control or assurance or whatever, security blanket, whatever you want to call it. But that was one of the things that we implemented with the fractals. Was like, okay, let's try. They had used them. I think they'd been using them for a while for like clean sounds and effects and stuff like that. And then they had the boogies. They had like the rack mount rectifiers with an ISO cab as well. And so we were trying to see if we could basically get rid of the cabinets and the rectos. And so we built a bunch of patches, and like I said, it was kind of varying degrees of success. And here's something that, again, talking about kind of the right tools for the right job and kind of just understanding what's what. It became very apparent that like just there was almost too many options.
Right.
And so when you're dealing with a let's say a rectifier that has relatively minimal controls compared to, let's say, a fractal or even a Mark IV or a whatever, right? And an ISO cab that, you can mark your spot on it and you can get the microphone there, but when, every day you open that thing up, the mic's going to be in a different spot, and you really don't have much of an opportunity to like you're not going in there and moving the mic a half an inch like you would in the studio, right? So it's kind of like, it's just the options are kind of limited, and I think ultimately that in the live setting that's almost a benefit, where you can't be like, let's change the bias 3 points, or let's what you like, no, you're, or even IRs, like that was a hard thing, is even just like picking IRs. It was like analysis paralysis.
Yep.
The Dynacabs weren't out at the time, and that I think that would be huge, especially being able to have like the computer at front of house
Right.
And just drag the Dynacab around and be like, oh, that sounds good. Like, cool.
Done. I never thought about that. You could do that if you had a bunch of Axe-Effects to set up and just let your front of house engineer decide that. That's,
I mean, I don't know if you'd want to do that, but you definitely, like be able to hear it, being able to make decisions like that through the PA and
Well, I'm sure, just sorry to cut you off, but I'm sure I listened to an interview years ago where it was whoever Tom Petty's front of house engineer. I think it was Tom Petty, but they had a what's the mic robot called? The Dynamount. They had a Dynamount on stage, and he was just driving it from front of house to put the mic where he wanted it. So it was like crazy.
Yeah. I mean that would be ideal. Like totally with the Dynacabs for sure. Being able to control that up front. That's kind of in my brain, like that's almost like next level with, if we want to go down that road again. But yeah, even so somebody actually mentioned, I think somebody took a snapshot of the fractals from one of the gigs or something like that.
Yeah, I saw that.
They're like, what are the settings? What's the preset? Whatever. And to be honest with you, like it's very like stock. Like I think everything might be like at noon. Maybe the mids are down a little bit. Like it's nothing. It's nothing out of the norm. Like there's no secrets in there. It's a pretty basic patch. I think they still have the rectos in the rack, I think. So I think it might be a combination of the two. Yeah, I mean, honestly, again, it's like, man, you could, if you're dealing with somebody who's used to being like, I don't want all those options. I just want to have a mic in the spot that I put it in every night.
Yeah,
just
exactly.
Put all the markings, the knobs on these markings every day, and we're good to go. And then we'll deal with everything else at front of house. Sometimes that's kind of the way to go, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
with say, obviously on your end, you're doing it in the studio, but there's obviously other processing going on through front of house. With, say, using an Axe-Effects for tracking, how much are you doing on the back end? Like, are you running it through mic pre's or extra outboard gear to get more of a vibe and maybe add that, the little bit of chaos that we were talking about earlier, or are you doing a bunch of processing in the box?
Yeah, I mean, I mainly, I try to tweak, not really get like micro tweaky, but I try to, I don't just stick to a preset as we've already kind of discussed. Like I'll use a starting point and I'll tweak it. But I'll usually kind of record just, pretty basically, straight in, not going to go into any external stuff. All of the kind of the additional stuff usually starts happening. I don't want to say in mix stage, because if while we're producing the song, I'm like, I need to brighten those up, or if I need to, crunch them up a little bit more and put a decapitator on them or something like that, or whatever. Like I'm not super precious about it. It's kind of like whatever it needs. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I don't really, again, it's like, running them through a Neve pre and, kind of driving them. I'm like, yeah, okay, whatever.
Could do.
But it's like you can kind of do. You can kind of do that within the Fractal if you want, and you can absolutely do that in Pro Tools after the fact as well.
Yeah, there's a million saturation plugins that'll do.
Yeah, and so it's a matter of what do you want to do? How do you want to do it? What's the best thing? Are you gonna like? Again, if we're really early in the production process, I like making decisions. Like when I'm tracking drums, I'm printing EQs, I'm printing compression, I'm
Mm-hmm. That's cool.
Yeah, like no plugins, and it already sounds like a real kit. Like that's the goal. Guitars, same thing. It's like no plugins. Yeah, that sounds like the guitar we wanted at this particular time. Once we start layering up a production, all of a sudden those guitars might be too dark, or maybe those guitars have too much bottom end or whatever. So then you got to start tweaking. But like I said, all of that stuff, you just kind of figure out as you go.
Since you just mentioned that, can I just ask you two questions? Maybe
Absolutely.
2 questions. Maybe it's 1 question. Maybe it's 4 questions. Because in terms of tracking, everything depends, obviously. Are you still like predominantly like quad tracking rhythm guitars for like the big rock stuffs, or are you doing more or less? Like, what's your kind of approach at the moment with that? Do you have a standard sort of approach?
Yeah, I would say like the again, not the rule, but like this is pretty much like I'm always gonna want this, and if I don't, it's easy to remove one. I'll always obviously double.
Yep.
And then typically the quads typically have a purpose.
Yep. Okay.
So if all I'm looking for is just like bigger and louder, I can do that with automating the EQ and turning up the volume on the doubles, right?
Yep.
Like the left and the right. Typically when I'm going quad, sometimes I refer to like kind of like when things kind of change a little bit, I refer to them as scene changes. It's like when I want a little bit of a scene change.
That's cool.
That's when I'll be like, okay, let's add a layer to that. And that layer, again, I'm very like purpose, I'm very intentional. Like what is this layer doing? So if it's kind of like, okay, well, once the chorus kicks in, we've got background vocals, the drums are now, bigger, maybe because it's not the closed hat. Maybe now it's washing on a crash cymbal or something. The frequency spectrum's completely different. And now the guitar's not speaking the same way it did in the part before it.
Yeah,
love that. So now we'll do a triple and a quad with a sound that, again, for lack of a better term, speaks better. Or more of what we're looking for in that section, or fills a frequency, or does something. Sometimes you just want to you don't want to hear. It's funny how like a lot of people are like, they want everything super articulate and super perfect and whatever, and it's like sometimes you don't want that. Not that you want sloppy playing, but like you want it tight. But by doing a triple and a quad, even if it's with the same sound or slightly different sound, nothing too drastic. Sometimes that just smears it. So it's kind of like, now it's less about a guitar player playing a part, and now it's just about a sound.
A wall.
Right? Yeah. And so again, it's kind of like, what do you need? What do you want? I'm of the opinion, especially when it comes to like a left and a right, if I ever want a mono, or just want one, it's really easy to turn off the second one. Most of the time, I'm going to want the second one. So even if I think I'm like, we're just probably only going to use one, I will just about always grab a second one.
Yep.
Third and a fourth, no, I'll only do those when we need them. And then one of the other things that I like to do, I'm giving you guys all my secrets. One of the other things I like to do is...
I've learned more about recording in the last 2 minutes than I have in the last 10 years. So
don't stop. Yeah, no worries.
Well, this is me listening and learning. I don't listen and learn from you, Troy.
Oh, come on. Yeah,
I just play bad.
Yeah, he just fixes all your stuff, right?
He fixes me.
Well, I've got a related question, but yeah, go on. Sorry.
No, but then then the other thing that I like to do is I'll do another layer of intentionally. If there is a part, I'm trying to think of, we were talking about Feed the Machine the other day. Or the other minute, an hour ago. Feed the Machine. I'm trying to remember the riff. Those chicka. We'd put another layer of the chickas.
Okay, that makes sense.
So like there would be a chicka. That would be like a 5 and a 6.
Yep. That's awesome. I love that.
And again, I refer to them as like accents. Like we need to, if there's something in there that we need to accent. I'm trying to think of another song that's like, it's kind of like an obvious thing in it. Like I don't know if I'm sure they did it in this, but like Burn It to the Ground, like the main riff. That part, the diddle-a-diddle-a, I'd be shocked if there wasn't like another layer.
Right.
Like just so that way it's accenting those parts. And it's like almost like if you think of like an orchestra, I don't know how many people watching or listening are into like classical music, but like orchestras are, I'm not into classical music. When I was in LA, I used to love going to see like John Williams do like all the scores from those movies. Like we'd go to the Hollywood Bowl. Me and my wife would go a couple times a year.
There.
Oh, amazing. I saw
amazing.
Yeah, we saw Back to the Future. I think I've seen probably like 10 of them. They're incredible. But I'm always just blown away like with John Williams. There's so many great writers and arrangers, but like the way that they will use, one of the string players or the horn players will literally sit there for a minute not doing anything, and then one part, and they're like, ba 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 ba, and then they're out.
Yeah.
And then they sit there and wait for that part to happen again or till the next thing. And so I kind of think of guitar layers a little bit like that.
Well, yeah, traditionally, like classical music, a double bass can only sound so loud. So if you wanted more double bass in your song or your piece, you just add more bass players. No, you just add more bass players. Like all of a sudden you got 40, 45 bass players in the band. It's like, well, now it's going to give you the impact. So
yeah. Or have them not play the part before.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, and then when he comes in, it's going to sound huge. Yeah.
So here's the thing, right? Like every other AC/DC song, they do the thing where the bass comes in for the chorus.
Yes.
I went down this rabbit hole of like, that's one, such a great trick, but two, where does it come from and what other songs do it? It's All Right Now. Like that's the ground zero for it because the bass doesn't come in until the chorus, right? And obviously, like Free only had one guitar player, but if you do that with a bass and a guitar, it's live. Obviously, that sounds colossal, but I love the way that they do that for so many of their. It's like, obviously, when you're recording a song, you can listen to the whole thing and mark out this is when it needs to get to like 11.
Yeah.
So we're going to make sure that's still as intense. And Troy, this is something I think about a lot because I remember you saying this. It's like, with a song, you want to have that shade in there of like, some songs only ever get to 7 but they start at like 6.5. So they're a little bit like, to listen to. But one, if you have that dynamic range, and then two, when you want to push it, push it all the way to 11, have everything all in, but you don't necessarily need to start there.
Yeah.
No, and exactly. You don't have to start there. And there's also, again, there's so many different ways, just from a production standpoint. There's so many different ways to get there, right? So again, it's like sometimes, sometimes adding more layers of guitars. Again, it I don't want to say muddies it up, but it starts undefining. It starts.
I like how you said smear. That's a good way.
Yeah,
sometimes smear is cool, but sometimes not.
And exactly. And it's almost like, maybe a filter on a camera, right? Like sometimes you want like the 8K, like, holy shit, I'm there. Yeah. And other times you kind of want I'm not a film guy, so I'm going to make the bad analogy, but whatever the old film is that, all the cool indie filmmakers like to make, it's just a matter of like, what is the purpose? So I'm very intentional about that. I'm not just going to go record a bunch of layers for no reason.
Well, so here's the thing. So when Leon and I started doing stuff, Cat?
Hello, Cat.
Great timing.
Come on, keep turning. I want to get the whole show.
we want the whole butt.
People listening on the podcast apps on Spotify or whatever, you need to probably just tune into whatever. What's it? An hour and 6 minutes probably. But yeah, so when Leon and I started doing stuff together a really long time ago, I've told this story on this before, but like we had someone that we met who was like, "Oh, I've been to LA and I know how they do it." And you need to do like 6 takes of every guitar track and then octaves higher and octaves lower and then vocals, same sort of deal and da-da-da. And so like, obviously, and this is probably like 2012, 2011. It's like, okay.
That sounds like the playbook from 2010.
Yeah. And so, but I was like, all right, well, that's what we're going to do. So everything that we did was without purpose. The purpose was, well, this is how they do it. And so there's times like, and in that exact room that Leon is sitting in right now, there's a song that we did about 10 years ago where it's like 10 layers of the same riff. And this is like not Heaven Above because that's like 20 something. That was
Heaven Above is literally let's record the riff with every guitar we own.
Yeah, that
was its own thing.
But very Spinal Tap.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh yeah.
But it was just like I recorded all these guitars, and then the problem was it was like because I have 10 layers of guitars that took so long to record, I have to use them. Yeah. And I didn't have the balls just go like, this is terrible. And so now I'm trying to fit 10 things into this space that all sound smeared. So now you have no clarity on the guitar sound. It's just, it's maturity. It's not listening. It's doing things what you think it's supposed to be rather than what it actually needs to be.
Well, so. and then here's the thing. And again, this something that, I think we were talking a little bit before we started. Like I've started doing live streams as well, right? where I'll just pick a topic and do a 3-hour like enduro live stream on,
They're excellent. People should definitely
thank you.
go and subscribe to your YouTube channel and keep up with them, because it's just like knowledge dump. Like here is, you should probably go and watch this multiple times, but also if you don't, you're probably still going to learn more than your crap music school in a semester.
I get to the end of them and I'm like, well, that was 3.5 hours. I feel like I've just been talking to myself for the last half a day. But yeah, but one of the things that I try to preach in those, and I try to be careful when I say, how I say certain things. You're talking about, the 10 layers, and you're like, yeah, I wasn't mature enough to like realize I didn't need this and whatever. Some people will, and if I say, yeah, I totally know what you mean, some listeners will interpret that as, oh man, 10 layers is way too much. Well, 10 layers is not way too much if that's what it needed, or if that's what you were trying to do. Mm-hmm. So it just all circles back to like, what's the purpose? What's the intent? What's the, what are you trying to achieve? What problem is that solving by adding more layers and different sounds and different guitars and different, like, so not to counter punch that, but it's like, that's kind of what it is, right? It's like,
yeah, absolutely. And the positive part of that is like, if you've explored the limits, then and if you've only ever recorded one guitar part, you know what? I don't know if you find this, but I find it's weird. Sometimes people talk about like, oh, my mix isn't wide enough. And I'm just kind of like, I don't know. That's not really been an issue. If I've got a double tracked guitar, it's pretty fucking wide, man. Like, and then you listen to a song, it's like, oh, okay, you've got like a Fender Princeton with one mic on it and a little bit of reverb. It's like, okay, well, maybe, that's going to work for certain sorts of music. So obviously that's the thing.
Yeah.
Maybe try doubling something, and it's kind of not that tricky.
No. And it's interesting that, kind of like what I was saying when we were talking about like the bass players in the orchestra. It's like, yeah, if you want to give that or a free coming, all right now coming in, the bass coming in the chorus is like, how you make the bass sound really big? He doesn't play the part before it.
Yep.
And so when you're talking about, when you're talking about scenarios where you're like, I want something to be really wide. And it's like, okay, cool. Well, yeah, we've got wideners, and I'm the biggest abuser of like fake wide stereo psycho, and I'm like, I have to rein myself in daily on that shit, because it's so cool, but it is what it is. But it's like, if you want something wide, make the part before it not that wide.
Yeah, so good.
It's pretty.
Like, huh?
So it's like something as simple as like, the verse, maybe you do like don't double it.
Yeah.
Maybe it is mono.
Or just pan him in a little bit. And then...
or if you do have a double, maybe it's panned in a little bit. And then when it gets to the chorus, it goes all the way out, right? Like, or that's a scenario of maybe you do, here's another kind of trick. If you're going to do a quad, maybe for the verse or the part before, whatever the big wide thing is, just have it almost like slightly bandpassed to where it's like you're not getting a lot of sizzle, and you're not getting maybe a ton of low end. It's a good sound, but it's not like super full frequency. Mm-hmm. And then when the chorus kicks in, you add the triple and the quad, and it's not that you're like, oh, I want to smear the part. You might even switch to a different sound, but you just open up the frequency that then you're like, oh, well, all of the high end and the low end is in the middle until the chorus. And now all of a sudden the chorus has got high end and low end too.
That's a really good idea. I like that.
Like stuff like that. It's, whenever I'm having an issue, it's interesting. Like when I'm mixing, whenever I'm having an issue like that I'm like, I've tried everything. And it's like, I can't get the chorus to pop. It doesn't sound wide enough. It doesn't this, that, the other thing. I'd say like maybe half the time, the problem isn't the section of the song I'm having a problem with. It's the section before. Yep. And then I'll go to the section before and be like, okay, cool. How can I set this up? Mm-hmm. Again, talking about like movie making, right? You know, one of the things I was just having this conversation with somebody the other day. A friend of mine was traveling, and he's like, oh, I watched the new John Wick movie on the plane. And he's like, it's crazy, right? And I'm like, you know what? I like the first one best. And he's like, He's like, why is that? And I'm like, the first one had breaks between the fighting scenes, and the fighting scenes weren't 9 minutes long. Mm-hmm. And I said, so when the fighting scenes and all the guns and stuff actually happened, I was like, holy shit.
Yep.
Like I was like, you know, in the newer stuff, it's still good, but it's like, you just get so like, kind of like, you just become desensitized to it.
Yep.
And the same thing happens with music, especially like with production and mixing and stuff like that. It's like, if you are hearing all of the frequencies all the time in all of the speakers, it's just going to sound flat. It's hard then to get anything to pop. It's hard to get any sort of, width. It just starts sounding like you've calibrated your ears that is normal.
Yep.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
if you want something to be special, you need to recalibrate what normal is so that thing can be special.
Yep.
If everything's all special, nothing's special.
Yeah. We watched Oppenheimer the other night, and there's that gigantic explosion, and it's like, well, you know, it's pretty quiet right before that, and then that's the effect.
There was nothing right before that.
Yep.
Nothing. Yeah. No music.
Yeah, I watched the Matrix trilogy recently, and the first one is just like the action when it happens. I was like, holy fuck, this is so good. And the second one, he's like fighting agents for half of the movie and just like, you know, I know
whatever.
kung fuing, and you're like, yeah, cool, bro, okay. But the first one just, again, it's that pacing thing. It's
too much L1.
This is the art factor of these things, right? No one can actually tell you how to do it. You just kind of have to do it, and it might suck, or it might be great, or it might just be kind of okay.
Yeah, but I mean, we can do the same thing with guitar sounds and drum sounds and all that stuff, right? There's so many different tricks that you can use. I mean, none of them are tricks. They're just techniques, right? There's just all these different techniques that you can use. You just have to kind of, again, know why you're doing them, and then just kind of ask yourself, like, well, how do I want to go about achieving it? And that's where the fun part kind of comes in. So,
yeah. That's awesome. Chris, I'm very prescient of your time. We've gone well over an hour here.
No,
it's been amazing.
I'm good as like I said, I usually do these things for 3 hours. So you guys, you guys cut me off.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I've got one last question. Troy, do you have maybe one last question, and then we can do those and then wrap?
I have a question with that. Maybe once we wrap, I might just ask you separately, because it's really nerdy and I don't want to bore everybody. And it's a very specific thing. So
this is just one last thing about playing the guitar, right? And Troy and I were chatting about this last night, because he just got a little Marshall SV20. Sounds awesome.
Nice.
And he was playing some AC/DC riffs. With like actual guitar players coming in and playing, the ability to just not have the guitar make sound when you want it, you know, having worked with so many different players, like, have you found that like, what for you makes a good recording guitar player is my question. Is it what they do or what they not do?
Yeah, you were alluding to it there, and there's like probably like 3 or 4 other things that I would say. So, I've been very fortunate. I've worked with some pretty awesome guitar players. Some of the best of those players have been the guys who, like, they're not like on the cover of Guitar World. People are like, they might be like the rhythm guitar player in the band, or maybe like, the songwriter or something that like is working with them. Like, there's so many different scenarios where you're like, it's not the Flash. It really isn't. Mm-hmm. So there's a few things for me that maybe these are in order, maybe they're not, but obviously you got to be able to play the parts, which is not always a given. Mm-hmm. It's amazing how many times like you'll hear a demo and then you get the guitar player and they'll be like, I'm like, you can't play this part? Like, what? But that's, again, kind of how music is made these days. It's like maybe they pieced it together. Maybe it came from a songwriter who did the demo and wrote the riff, and like there's all these different factors, right? So obviously, can you play the part properly? Tuning and timing is huge. And a lot of people think they just tune the guitar and then all of a sudden, well, no, like it's in tune. And it's like, no, it doesn't work like that. how hard you hit the string, how hard you fret the string. When you're fretting, are you like pulling your middle finger down more than you're pulling the others? Are you fretting too hard and it's going sharp? All of these different things factor into tuning. And I don't even want to call it tuning. It's almost like, again, going back to the orchestra, it's like, you know, a violin player or a cello player does not have frets.
Yeah.
And so the intonation isn't just a thing that you'd take your guitar to your guitar tech and have them set once a year. It's like your intonation is every chord you play, every part you play, like how hard you press it, how you're fretting it, how hard are you hitting the strings. All of this stuff factors into that. So tuning is a big thing. So right out of the gate, I would qualify some of the best guitar players I've worked with, or a good guitar player is, can you play in tune, like within whatever you're playing? Yeah, the whole controlling of the strings that aren't supposed to be ringing, or like, you know, if you're playing 3 strings, how you go about then muting the rest of them, or how you move around and on the fretboard to where, is it noisy? Is it not noisy? And I'm not saying it always has to be silent, but it's just like whatever it is has to work. So there are some times where, you know, somebody will be playing something and I'll be like, yeah, when you slide up, can you mute those other strings somehow? Or, you know, we've got a lot of like studio tricks. You stick foam under the strings. Something I do. I'm a bad guitar player, but I know how to play guitar when it comes to like recording. A lot of the times, if the guitar player's sitting next to me, like I'll watch him for like maybe like 3-4 cycles of a riff, or as he's playing the part, and I'll see which string is ringing. And as he moves to where he's not supposed to be, I'll put my finger on it and then I'll let off. And then I'll put my finger on it and I'll let off. So it's like, yeah, like these are the things that we do in the studio, right? And that's not saying the guitar player is bad. Sometimes it just has to be done.
Yep.
But yeah, I've worked with a few guitar players that, you know, people have seen on, you know, on Guitar World magazine and all that shit. And they can solo for days, and playing rhythm guitar is painful. And so it's one of those things, like with drummers. I think drummer, like a lot of the time people are like, who are the best drummers? And I'm like, for me, it's not about how quickly you can play and how complicated the fills are and all that stuff. It's obviously how solid you can play. What's the drum sound like when you hit it? Are you playing it even? That's another thing with guitar playing that I find varies drastically from player to player, is like, how much control do they have over their dynamics? So, you know, especially when you're talking about like arpeggiated parts where like the top notes are just jumping out like crazy. So like, I have a hard time like controlling that if I'm playing something, but I'm super aware of it. Some guys just aren't even aware of it.
Yep.
And so you're like, hey, can you play when you hit the B's just jumping out like crazy. Can you play that lighter? And then they play everything lighter. You're like, no, everything else was good. Like they just don't have any control over that. And I think ultimately it's like, I just don't think people know what to listen for. Like they don't, like I'll tell you right now, like when I started working with Scott, when I went down to LA, and he was hypersensitive to tuning. And so when we would be tuning things, or when you'd have a guitar player or a bass player, and there was like, he'd be like, oh, we're flat. I'd be like, this sounds fine to me. And I became very sensitive to it as well. Yep. And then when I started kind of like playing guitar again, like, cause when I was kind of like first 3-4 years of engineering, like I didn't play guitar very often. I was like busy doing that stuff, but I started picking up guitars and be like, I'm terrible. Like there's strings ringing all over the place. I'm like, the intonation slightly different. Like the chords aren't ringing. And I'm like, I'm no worse than I was like a couple of years ago when I was like playing in a band and like thought we sounded pretty good, but I couldn't hear it. I just didn't know. I didn't like, so
knowing what to listen for.
Yeah. And then being able to like actually hear it enough and have somebody or something to be like, no, right there. You hear that? You hear that? And you're like, oh, I hear it now. And once you start hearing it, then you can correct it. Yep. But I just don't think a lot of people can actually hear it.
Yeah, that's not something you get from your guitar teacher, unfortunately. That's like, we'll show you some scales and show some chords, but it's like, the control thing, particularly when you're playing with lots of distortion and And also like guitar player, you know, you're talking about like, oh, you know, slide up and maybe make this string not ring out so much. Because I'm sure you do the same thing. Like I'm always trying to get the part to be better if it's not quite right, or maybe finger it in a different way.
Yep.
And like Leon's pretty good. Like he will change and do stuff whenever required. Might take like a couple of goes. I've had people come in. It's like we're sitting there for 15 minutes just trying to get one thing.
15 minutes. That's
like
try like
luxury.
4 hours.
Oh well, there you go. It's just.
No, but it's changed for me now as well, because like when we started recording together, Troy, I was just a guitar player. Like I made noises, and that like the process of trying to know what to listen for, like all these things you just mentioned, Chris, is like, yeah, things I did not know how to do, and now they're always at the forefront of my mind. I probably still can't do them, but at least I know what to listen for. I know what to go for. It's like, it's a totally different skill that you need to develop, and you kind of need to develop it in conjunction with someone. You need a producer to basically just tell you how it is and be like, you're rushing. Okay, you don't know what rushing is, do you? Okay, this is what it is. Your intonation's off because you're pressing too hard. Try this, and have those. It makes you. What I found is it makes you really perform when you're recording, rather than just recording guitar.
Yeah, going through the motions. You got to be engaged.
It's like a performance.
Yeah. No, it's an interesting thing, and like you said, it's like you got to know what. You got to know what to listen for, but then you also don't want to then just like bombard people with all those thoughts. So it is something like you don't want to be like, you want to figure out a way to kind of like find your practice time for that, or don't show up and be like, okay, I'm gonna now concentrate on muting my strings because we're recording. And it's like, no, like. When work that into your practicing, or work that into how you're doing it, so that way it just becomes natural, right? It becomes an instinct, and you're not thinking about it. So
that's awesome. Yeah, far out, man. This has been an amazing. I'm so glad we finally got to do this episode, Chris.
Great. Yeah, thank you
so much.
Where can people find you on the internet if they want to learn more, they want to work with you, whatever else? Let us know. All the deets.
ChrisBaseford.com is probably the kind of the all-encompassing. I'm on Instagram, Chris Baseford on Instagram, and we mentioned earlier on YouTube. And again, Chris Baseford, nice and easy.
So there you go. Ladies and gentlemen, Chris Baseford. Thank you for joining us, mate.
Thank you, guys.
We'll see you next time. Peace. And yeah, for everyone else, thank you very much. And hopefully be back next week, eh?